I believe weightlifting is one of the most misunderstood or misconstrued sports on the planet.
Is it deadlift?
Powerlifting. Powerlifting.
He's deadlifting.
Powerlifting.
Muscle lift.
Oh, it's like a CrossFit thing.
People largely don't know what it is. With a very strange and controversial history that encompasses corruption, bribery, and quite possibly the heaviest drug use of any Olympic sport, as well as the potential loss of weightlifting's Olympic spot, has led it to continue down this path of mystery. So this video is designed to give you the fundamental outline and the history and progress of this amazing sport. This is the casual's guide to weightlifting. Let's start with the name of the sport, weightlifting. Already, we're off to a bad start. Many people, and rightly so, would just say that weightlifting is the act of lifting weights. So we add the word Olympic. That's fine, but the sport is performed mainly out of the Olympics. From world championships to continental championships, all the way down to local meets, weightlifting is performed all over the place. Furthermore, we don't usually call any other Olympic sport with the prefix of Olympic. It's just swimming, gymnastics, track and field, etc. So what would be a better name? Well, that clip from earlier.
Powerlifting. Powerlifting.
Powerlifting. Powerlifting.
That's powerlifting.
Yeah, powerlifting. See, oddly enough, weightlifting is actually a better test of power, and powerlifting is just a test of force. The rate at which the force develops or increases is the magical metric in the sport of weightlifting. Whereas powerlifting, it's more about constant maximal force being applied to the barbell. The person who can combine the best technique with the highest change of speed, aka rate of force development, is going to win in the end. So why on earth would they call this sport weightlifting when it would cause so much confusion? Well, first of all, historically, weightlifting, or the lifting of weights, wasn't something that the average general population did. In 1896, weightlifting as an Olympic sport was introduced as a part of track and field events. There were an assortment of one-handed and two-handed lifts. It looked nothing like it does today. And like I'd said moments ago, the general population wasn't casually lifting weights to change their fitness at all. It was mainly just circus performers, strongmen, and the aptly called weightlifters. Fast forward to weightlifting's true inception into the Olympics in 1928, as a refined sport with 3 two-handed lifts: the snatch, the clean and jerk, and the clean and press. Because the press required no leg drive, athletes often used momentum from an awkward backward hinge to get the weight overhead. This began to lead to a very difficult judging process, and thus the press was abolished later in 1972. Since then, the sport has focused only on the snatch and the clean and jerk. All the while, the standardized barbell measurements from the sport of weightlifting had been adopted into commercial gyms worldwide. And this is when we start to see the confusion kind of happen even more. The standardized quote-unquote Olympic barbell is the most universally used piece of equipment in most gyms across the world. Often those people are doing powerlifting or basic strength movements, not the snatch and the clean and jerk. So much so that the last thing people are thinking about when they look at Olympic spec barbells is the sport of weightlifting. That would be like if somebody saw an Olympic-sized pool with lanes and the last thing they thought about was swimming laps. So at first, weightlifting was a great name for the sport. And now people use a weightlifting bar, they do the lifting of weights, so it's not really the best term for it. Anyways, let's move on. According to a famous paper titled History of Doping in Sport by Charles E. Yasalis, scientific organotherapy began in June of 1889, when a 72-year-old scientist, Charles Edouard Brown-Séquard, self-administered over the period of 3 weeks 10 subcutaneous injections of blood of the testicular veins, semen, and juice extracted from a testicle from either a dog or a guinea pig. He claimed that there were radical changes in his health that scientists later would claim was just likely placebo effect. However, Brown-Séquard is largely seen as the godfather of endocrinology and led to this massive push in this scientific community. But it wasn't until 1935 when scientists were able to synthesize testosterone. It was rumored by some that German athletes were given testosterone at the 1936 Games in Berlin. However, this is all just undocumented conjecture. The first recorded case of an athlete using testosterone was in 1941, and it was administered to a trotter racehorse named Holloway. This 18-year-old horse went from a serious decline in performance to winning and placing in a span of months. Then, in the early 1950s, the documentation of West Coast bodybuilders and their use of testosterone was noted. Right around the same time is when we saw the first account of systematic doping in sport, and this was the Soviet weightlifting team. Statistical analysis of the performance of the Soviet lifters during this period is consistent with this assertion, as well as the Soviet team doctor telling the US team doctor that the Soviets were taking testosterone. The US doctor started to administer US weightlifters with testosterone, and in 1958, when the Ciba pharmaceutical company released Dianabol, he began experimentation with this new drug. After several of the weightlifters achieved championship status while using anabolic steroids, news of the efficacy of these drugs apparently spread by word of mouth during the early 1960s to other strength-intensive sports, from field events to football. And the rest really is history. The true proliferation of PED use really started to take place in the 1960s through all sports. However, weightlifting will always be known as the godfather of PED use in sport. And it still is probably the most egregious PED use sports, at least in the Olympics. Then, with the formation of the World Anti-Doping Association, otherwise known as WADA, in 1999, we began to see a crackdown on PED use across all Olympic sport, including weightlifting. But because drug use was so embedded into the very fabric of the sport, weightlifting continued to be the worst transgressor of PED use.
This prompted the International Olympic Committee to have testing samples from the 2008 Beijing and 2012 London Olympic Games to be retested. And out of the 98 athletes that tested positive, 61 of them were weightlifters. Some of the biggest names in the sport were caught out, including the sport's very own poster boy, Ilya Ilin. He was one out of 6 weightlifters in his weight class that got caught out at the 2012 Olympic retests, which meant that lifters who originally placed 5th, 8th and 9th were given gold, silver and bronze medals. The scale of the doping problem prompted the IWF to reset all current world records by changing up the weight categories again, but this would prove to change nothing.
What may have been worse than the drug use in weightlifting was corruption at the highest order, led by the infamous Thomas Ayan. After a German documentary exposed potential corruption in the sport, a Canadian law professor investigated the IWF. This would largely be known as the McLaren Report. Overall, I found an organization that has been subject for close to half a century to an autocratic leader who dictated through various control mechanisms everything that occurred within the organization. This obsession with control created a culture of fear that prevented a vibrant and robust sports administration. We found systemic governance failures and corruption at the highest level of the IWF. Ayan would be paid large sums of money in cash, cold hard cash, for countries that had sanctions and drug use, and these big cash sums would ease their sanctions or it would completely expunge them of their sanctions. Ayan had effectively bought elections to remain in power, had complete financial control of the organization and its accompanying bank accounts. He had use of administrative powers, allowing for the exclusive staffing of the IWF Secretariat and infiltration of the confidential Anti-Doping Commission. I am not kidding you when I tell you that this is possibly the highest level of corruption in all of sport. And it happened all under everyone's nose because people don't know what weightlifting is. Ayan was voted out of power in 2020, but the IOC, or International Olympic Committee, wasn't very fond of weightlifting. Here we have a sport that is largely unpopular, causing the most amount of issues. And it's becoming more and more possible that weightlifting won't be an Olympic sport. So for those of you who thought that I was being too pedantic in the misnomer of weightlifting as the name of this sport, it's really important because what are we going to call Olympic weightlifting if it's not in the Olympics? Now that you're caught up, I guess I could attempt to turn this relatively negative piece around and explain the beauty of this sport.
And that's why I got into weightlifting. Like, one of the first videos I saw was Paris Dimas at the 1996 Olympics, and the only thing he was wearing was weightlifting shoes. And to me, he looked like an athlete.
See, the sport of weightlifting as a methodology is a very athletic one. The strength component or brute force component isn't nearly as important as the speed, technique, and mobility required. This isn't some sort of holier than thou approach. I'm simply trying to explain that weightlifting has more in common with track and field than powerlifting or bodybuilding. In my opinion, weightlifting is the perfect expression of precision, timing, power, grit, and grace. Whether it's the aggressive and loud lifting of Shi Jiyang or the quiet and tactical lifting of Lasha Talhadze, weightlifting is a beautiful sight and sound to behold. And I think it's important that more people in this world really know what it's all about. Thank you for watching.